Welcome to the first episode in our three-part podcast series, where we explore the findings in the UK Agri-Tech Centre's Livestock and Aquaculture Innovation report, which is all about shaping the next 10 years. As part of this report, we consulted with over 150 stakeholders representing commercial, academic and different organisations from right across the supply chain through a series of surveys, workshops and interviews. And the report itself dives into recommendations for research and development, sector priorities for aquaculture and for livestock, and that includes dairy, beef, sheep, pig and poultry farming. And it's all done through the lens of creating impactful progress, improving and redefining sustainable food systems. So in today's episode, we'll be introducing you to the opportunities and challenges faced by the aquaculture and livestock sectors. From groundbreaking technologies right through to the adoption of climate smart solutions, the future of these sectors is full of potential and complexity. So joining me today, we have two key members of our innovation team here at the UK Agri-Tech Centre, Martin Sutcliffe and Megan Powell. And they'll both be sharing their insights on the evolving landscape of these two key sectors and discussing the exciting advancements and their thoughts on shaping the future and potential of these two sectors. So first up, Martin, who is an aquaculture sector specialist. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, sure. Long story short, marine biologist by training, did a bit of diving, scuba diving around the world, worked for the public aquarium sector. So always dealing with aquatic animal health and exhibit design and public engagement. And then in 2014, I joined an organisation called Native Marine Centre, who were developing one of the first lumpfish farms in the UK. And that was my kind of cross to the dark side, where I started to work in commercial aquaculture. And since then, it's been my passion.
So for those that have never heard the term or don't quite understand it, what exactly does aquaculture mean?
If you looked it up in the dictionary, it would be farming of organisms in the water. So that can be anything from rivers, from ponds, into the sea, into estuarine environments. It's basically the cultivation of aquatic organisms. And that ranges from fish to shellfish, to seaweeds, to microalgae, to macroalgae, all sorts of things. So it's a very diverse sector. But what tends to happen, because in the UK in particular, salmon is such a large sector, a lot of the conversation tends to focus on the salmon sector. And so the other sectors tend to fall down the wayside a little bit, but they're just as important and provide good jobs and kind of stable jobs around the country, just as important as the salmon sector.
And how big is the aquaculture sector in the UK?
It's a £1 billion industry.
Wow.
But caveat to that statement is the majority of that is salmon. So I think over 95% of production in the UK is salmon. And the UK sector is also dominated by Scotland. So I think a few years back, I think 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic, salmon production in Scotland was around about 190,000 tonnes per annum. And as a comparison to the size and scale of the sector in England, at the same time, all forms of aquaculture was 8,000 tonnes. So it gives you an idea of the scale and size of salmon. But the sector is very diverse. You have salmon, you have trout from a finfish point of view, and then you also have bivalve shellfish, so that's filter feeding shellfish, scallops, mussels, oysters, clams, all those sort of tasty things. And then what's starting to emerge now is the seaweed sector. More and more people are starting to understand how to grow seaweed, different species of seaweed, and the applications that might have.
My next question really, what exactly does the import and export landscape look like? How much of our aquaculture production is exported?
Salmon is the biggest food export after whiskey from Scotland. So away from the other parts of aquaculture, salmon actually really dominates things. Not to get political, but Brexit made things a little bit more tricky with regards to exports. So shellfish, for example, bivalve shellfish, mussels, before Brexit were in effect traded as a commodity with the European Union. And then since then, because we're now outside of the European Union, we need to meet much more stringent water quality to be able to trade freely with the EU from a shellfish point of view. So that's made it a little bit more tricky, but still a lot of our shellfish and salmon and other aquaculture products, in fact, seafood in general, is exported because we just don't eat it in this country. We eat 5 main things in this country from a seafood point of view. That's salmon, cod, tuna, haddock, and shrimp.
So we are going to dive more into some of the science, some of the innovation, some of the more interesting things going on within the aquaculture sector in a later episode. But in this one, I just wanted to touch on what you think the major challenges are. I know you've already mentioned regulation and demand, of course, being the two primary ones. But when it comes to that science side, the research and innovation side, what do you think some of the barriers are? And on the flip side, the opportunities?
I think new and emergent diseases, as our seas warm, there's new and emergent diseases that we're still not fully on top of and fully understand. I was speaking to a stakeholder in the salmon sector a couple of months back, and I just casually asked him, what's your biggest fear at the moment? And he said that the salmon sector will just disappear from Scotland, which is huge. It's a really big sector in Scotland, and it supports a lot of jobs. I think there's upwards of 3,000 jobs across the supply chain in Scotland, maybe even more. And so for a sector like that to disappear, and don't forget, these are in remote places like the Highlands and Islands of the west coast of Scotland. So for an industry like that to suddenly disappear from the landscape, it would be really impactful on those economies. So I think climate change, emerging diseases, our warming seas, we're seeing more and more frequently harmful algal blooms coming in, micro jellyfish appearing more and more frequently, which can affect fish gills. And so research around understanding the dynamics of those and how those can be mitigated for using innovative technologies or kind of mitigation factors, bubble curtains, sinking the cages lower in the sea, whatever it might be, things around that. The disease, new and emergent diseases, so vaccines and understanding how they work and developing those new vaccines and trialing those new vaccines, I think is critical. And then away from salmon, how can we start to utilize the byproducts of some of the sectors? So shellfish, do you eat the shellfish shell? No, you don't. That's a resource. That's pure calcium carbonate pretty much. So how can we start to innovate around the use of those and start to create a proper circular economy around the shellfish sector? But then the other question is, what do we do with the meat? So that comes back to the shellfish by stealth, or the seafood by stealth.
One of the key themes when we're looking at the Livestock and Aquaculture report that we produced was sustainability, and a real central theme to what's discussed within the report. To be sustainable, we need a diversity of diet and diversity of what we're growing. So I guess my next question is, how important do you think aquaculture will be for the UK to be more sustainable and diverse in the future?
If you're looking at it from a kind of a life cycle assessment point of view, farmed aquatic animals, and I include salmon and shellfish and all sorts of things in that, are some of the lowest input organisms you can farm. Mussels, for example, they require no input from a feed point of view. You hang them on a rope, simplifying it obviously massively, but you hang it on a rope and they grow in the sea. They filter the food out and they grow, and then you go and harvest them. So from a life cycle assessment point of view, from a carbon point of view, farmed aquatic food is some of the best you can eat. If we then look at that next step in feed conversion ratio, salmon again is up there with poultry, for example. You pretty much get a 1.2 feed conversion ratio. So from a 1.2 amount of food in, you get 1 amount of salmon out. So it's really good quality, low kind of impact protein.
So very important, essentially.
Yeah, I think. Yeah,
and a lot of opportunity for growth.
A lot of opportunity for growth, a lot of opportunity for diversification into like different niche production methods. So when we talk about aquaculture, there's so many different types of production methods and production environments and all that, and production species, that it's a really broad stroke when you say, oh, aquaculture. It's like saying agriculture. Try and describe agriculture in a few words. It's production of food on the land. Aquaculture is production of food in aquatic environment.
So within aquaculture, then, where would you say were the real opportunities for innovation and growth?
There's real opportunity for innovation in how we get the public engaged in aquaculture. There's a lot of, so in the UK, we don't really eat seafood, right? That's as I said, we eat 5 main species and that's it. If you gave someone a plate of mussels, they wouldn't know what to do with it by and large. And so how do we start to innovate the product that comes from the sea or from the aquatic environment into ways that the general consumer can get on board with it? So it's innovation in ways of product design and kind of seafood by stealth, I guess is probably a nice way to put it. How do you get those kind of high value, good protein, full of omega-3, all those kind of good things that are great for us? How do you get away from a plate of mussels into something that is easy to deal with and is that pre-prepared, which does exist? But even a lot of people, how many people go into a supermarket and buy a bag of pre-prepared mussels and go home and cook them? It's just not available. So how do we start to look at that and change that mindset of the UK public? Because then that enables us to actually tap into the potential food security that we've got. A few years ago, an organisation called CFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, did some research to try and understand space of sea was needed if we were to try and replicate the amount of seafood that comes from capture fisheries, so where fishermen go out and they capture it and bring it back to shore and it gets processed. If we were to try and replicate that from a farmed seafood point of view, what area of sea would be needed from the UK's exclusive economic zone, which is 200 miles offshore, all that sort of stuff? And it comes back as less than 1% would be needed. So it just shows you the potential that's there. But I keep coming back to the fact we don't eat it in the UK. We export many of our shellfish products because we just don't eat it. So how do we start to change that mindset?
Given that climate change and the environment is such a key part of policy and public opinion when it comes to their food, can you comment a little bit about aquaculture and how the impact it can have on the environment and potentially the carbon footprint of the various subsectors?
Aquaculture gets a bad press. Unfairly, obviously, I'm going to say this, but unfairly, I think. There's a lot of legacy bad taste in the public mouth about how the expansion of aquaculture in the UK kind of wasn't necessarily in the best interest of the environment at the time. And I'm going back sort of 30, 40 years, quite a number of time. And you see, obviously, a lot of stuff, particularly in the salmon sector, on kind of disease and issues with that and that kind of process that takes place. But actually what's happened in the sector over the last 10 years while I've been working in it is that there's been a hell of a lot of work to actually try and limit the impact that aquaculture has on the environment. It tends to be, it's fairly easy to point the finger at something that's out of sight and underneath the sea and kind of away from out of sight, out of mind sort of thing. And a lot of finger pointing gets done without necessarily fully understanding the change that's needed or the change that's taken place to actually get to the sector to where it is right now. And if you think about organisms like shellfish, bivalve shellfish, like mussels and scallops and things, they filter water. That's what they do. That's what they've evolved to do. They do that all day long while they're submerged. That's their life. And so actually there's an opportunity there, I think, to start to use filter feeding shellfish to help clean up the environment. There's a term which we can touch on possibly in a later episode called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which is where you have different species in close proximity. And so say, for example, you have a shellfish farm and a seaweed farm and then a salmon farm very close together. What starts to happen is you get a really interesting nutrient kind of exchange between those three installations. I was over in the Faroe Islands for a conference a little while back, and they grow seaweed. They grow a lot of seaweed. And the company I was with was actually saying that what they see is if they have their seaweed much closer to a salmon farm, it grows much quicker. And they think that's down to some of the nutrients and things that are coming out of the salmon farm. And so if you start to look at that kind of multi-trophic, multi-layered system dynamics, that's when it starts to get really interesting, I think.
There is always going to be a need to balance productivity, food security with environmental responsibility. For example, in our report, we look over the next 10 years. We want to consider food security and environmental responsibility hand in hand. Really, how does aquaculture fit into that? It seems to me like there's a real opportunity there, given the statistics and the data that you're giving, if there was a demand.
Well, that's the key thing, right? You've got to build demand to actually. There's no point in farming tens of thousands or millions of tons of seafood if nobody's going to eat it. You're wasting those resources. So the demand is one of the key points. I think from an aquaculture point of view, there's almost a two-pronged approach. You've got the fed aquaculture element, finfish, some crustaceans that actually require feed, and they then convert that feed into protein, similar the way to a lot of livestock, agricultural livestock animals do. And then there's the other side of the thing, which is the non-fed aquaculture. So that's your filter feeding shellfish, your seaweeds, all that, your microalgae that photosynthesize, all that side of thing. That it's a different story for both sides of it. From a fed aquaculture point of view, then obviously the key sustainability issue is the feed ingredients. How can we start to chip away at the life cycle assessment of the feed to make it as efficient as possible, and then alongside that, keeping feed conversion ratio as good as possible to produce the fish or the protein that we then eat. The non-fed side of things, then it's a whole different story. It's a whole different argument. I think that's where policy and regulation can really start to step in, because if you put a string of mussels out, again, simplifying it massively, but in 18 months to 2 years, you've got a load of protein that you can go and harvest. And that's basically it. There's very little interaction once the mussels are out and growing. They just filter feed.
Thanks for sharing all of that, Martin. It's so interesting. And it's really clear that aquaculture is a critical component of the UK's food system and a sector with immense potential for growth. I personally find the low environmental footprint of farming shellfish and seaweed really interesting, and the emerging technologies as well, particularly to help tackle challenges like climate change, disease. And I feel like that aquaculture could have a much bigger role in our food future in the UK. But as you mentioned, there are still significant hurdles to overcome, whether it's public perception, regulatory challenges, or creating stronger demand for seafood in the UK. But on the flip side, loads of potential with innovation, better policy frameworks, and a shift in consumer demand and behaviour. I feel like we could really use aquaculture to build a more resilient and sustainable food system. So massive thanks for that brilliant overview. So let's move on to another important sector, livestock. We've got Megan from our innovation team who's going to be joining us now to talk about the exciting innovations and challenges in livestock farming and touching on the report. So Megan, can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got involved in livestock research?
Yeah, sure. Grew up on a beef and sheep farm in mid Wales. Agriculture was a huge part of kind of what I've done and always done, grew up with. Grew up helping on the farm and working on neighbouring poultry farms. And I was born into agriculture and developed that passion from a really young age. I then went on to study an agribusiness at Harper Adams University, and that sort of led me into the more industry sort of side of the sector. I got awarded a British Poultry Council scholarship, and I was able to get my foot into the industry working for a poultry processor, and then was able to get into the industry after uni working for a beef processor and into sort of retail and beyond. So I've had a really practical experience in agriculture so far, and it's just really part of what I do and what I love.
So at the moment, what kind of sector within livestock, because it is so broad, where's your focus for research and innovation?
So although as part of my role in the innovation team, specifically the sustainability team at the UK Agri-Tech Centre, I do work across all livestock sectors, looking at all those sort of grand sustainability sort of derived challenges within those sectors and looking at sort of solutions. However, personally, I do have more experience within the ruminant sectors, so beef, sheep and dairy, just from my experience growing on my career so far, and more hands-on experience from a farming perspective. Although I think it's really important to make sure that we're focusing across all sectors and really having that balanced portfolio of what research we're focusing on.
Great to hear that you work cross-sector. How important do you think it is to take this multi-perspective approach to create real meaningful change and impact?
Yeah, so I think that it's really important. I think it's a really great thing that we've gone out into the industry and really talked to all of these stakeholders to help them shape the Agri-Tech Centre strategy. I think that's really important to ensure that what the Agri-Tech Centre does, it focuses our effort into what's actually relevant to the industry. That is the reason that we are here as an organisation, is to help the industry and support them accelerate innovation and match those solutions to those sort of grand challenges. And we are in that fortunate place where we can be that central sort of non-competitive force, bringing everyone together, where we can focus on those really grand challenges for the industry and really accelerate innovation solution in those areas. I think there's a bit of a challenge when people work in silos. There's different organisations and different sort of smaller groups doing the same thing, sometimes duplicating efforts, less resource available for that impact. So when people come together and through an organisation such as us to really increase that impact, increase that resource to really maximise that impact. And that's where we lead on to that collaborative approach as well. The collaboration is really key to maximising impact and making sure that we have that multi-perspective. So there's different types of stakeholders getting involved. We're not just speaking to certain groups of people. We're really bringing in all those different stakeholders from different sort of aspects of the supply chain, and particularly as well looking cross-sector, so looking livestock as a whole rather than individual sectors as well, to really pin those key learnings between sectors is really important, and linking those right people together as well. There can be sometimes a bit of a disconnect between different stakeholders within the industry, for example, like academics and the industry, the more corporate side of the supply chain. So really we're in that really fortunate position to bring those people together to link up the supply chain.
That's great. And just a follow-on question from that, you mentioned that sustainability really is your bread and butter. So this whole systems approach is obviously very important for sustainable food systems. How do you think that broader perspective can influence individual farmers, given that you're from a farming background?
Yeah, definitely. So for me personally, I really look at sustainability holistically, and it's really important that sustainability is considered holistically. I think it can be a bit of a perception that is just considered as greenhouse gas emissions and carbon, and that's what sustainability means. And even it's not just environment, it's because I think for me, sustainability is having that is a profitable, resilient food system. And it's really important to ensure it is not just greenhouse gas emissions in isolation. So really looking from that whole perspective. So environments are definitely including carbon, but also including nature, biodiversity, water quality, soil health, and all those other aspects. And then from the animal health side, making sure that's considered. And then also really importantly from the economic viability side as well.
Can you comment a little bit on profitability and how important it is?
A non-profitable business is not a sustainable business, so it's really important, and that's considered too. And I think more broadly as well, when particularly really relevant to some certain livestock systems, particularly in upland areas, for example, really ensuring that social sustainability is considered as well, and understanding what is that value of social sustainability and what benefits do these sort of livestock systems have to their community, to the environment, to the people that are living and working and thriving in those sort of environments that are centered around those livestock farms, for example.
That is such an interesting insight, because I don't often consider social sustainability when I'm thinking about sustainability as a topic. So that's really, really interesting. And I just want to follow up and say, how important is it that we consult with farmers on this innovation, research and development pathway?
I think that's really important as well, to bring farmers on that journey and really looking at their whole farm and thinking more holistically about them as a business and them being resilient and them producing food. That is the bread and butter of what they do. I think showing that we're working from that perspective will really help farmers understand that actually sustainability is a good thing. It's not that negative term that's thought about at the moment. It's a positive for their business. It's showing that they're going to be resilient for the future. And I think as well, in terms of the multi-system approach, is really important for concepts such as regenerative farming and circular farming and all of that. So really linking together that there's different systems within a farm and linking them together. So thinking utilising waste, animal manures, processing manures and things like that to improve soil health and increase the sort of nutrient content of grasses, for example. So there's so much you can do there in terms of bringing together different systems to create more value.
How do we make it easier for people on the ground who are doing the farming and people within agriculture to incorporate sustainability, environmental sustainability, particularly in their day-to-day running the farm?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think how you communicate it as well. So particularly from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, reducing emissions usually equals improving efficiency on farm. So it's really understanding that value for the farmer, and it's not just around reducing their carbon emissions. It's becoming more efficient. It's increasing their profits. It's helping them as a business, and that kind of also then reduces their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think then when thinking wider from a wider sustainability perspective, is again locking into that value. So if you look at improving your soil health and improving the quality of your grassland, for example, you're then potentially increasing the amount of carbon you can sequester on your farm. And it's not just doing something because it's sustainable, it's doing something because it's good for their farm, and what are the benefits of improving that nature and having those hedgerows on their farm. But then aside from that as well, it is really important that farmers are supported in the right way to be able to make these environmental changes where they are potentially reducing production to, for example, plant trees or do something as for a purely environmental gain.
So you studied at Harper, you started your career in innovation, research and development. What kind of changes would you really like to see in the next 10 years and beyond?
So I think having more transparency through the supply chain would be something I really like to see. And from that, all the way from farm to the consumers and everyone in between. So really more understanding from our consumer side of things, what is going on in our supply chain, how the food is produced, and also back more sort of understanding from the farmer perspective, what the customers want and what they're doing at the moment. I think that would be really important, really provide a lot of opportunity in terms of really bridging that gap between the farm and the consumers, and bringing farmers along the sustainability journey and understanding why they're doing it. So yeah, transparency would be a really key one for me. Another thing would be diversity, and this in all sort of senses. So through systems, having more diverse farming systems, for example, more livestock integrated in arable systems as well, and harnessing that benefits from a circular system. Diversity in terms of cropping and grasses, looking at more multi-species lays, for example, and having that more legumes and having those nitrogen fixing benefits into the soil. So that diversity sense there. In livestock species, so looking at having more sort of resistance in different sort of livestock species on the farm, having more mixed farms again, like I said before, and then obviously diversity in terms of biodiversity and having that more increased habitats, increased birds, pollinators, microorganisms within the soil.
So you do sit in the sustainability team, so diversity is obviously like a real interest of yours, especially in terms of livestock farming. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think diversity in all senses has a lot of benefit in terms of sustainable farming practices. And then I think, again, I'd like to see that more, those frameworks in place to really support our farmers and our supply chains to achieve those better environmental outcomes, and having that more alignment between the devolved nations as well. So having that more consistent support for farmers across the different devolved nations. I think that's a big challenge in terms of the supply chain, with often farmers from different nations in the UK supplying for the same supply chains, but have an unlevel playing field as such in terms of the support they're given. So more alignment there, I think, would be really important to really accelerate progress in terms of the sustainability journey.
It sounds like you feel like there's a lot of exciting opportunities for innovation, for growth. Could you expand on that a little bit? What are the big opportunities, do you think?
So I think there's a lot of opportunities in terms of helping farmers become more sustainable and being, like I've said before, being more sustainable in terms of environment and resilience and profit. But I think from an animal perspective, animal health is fundamental to a sustainable farming business, and an unhealthy animal is not a sustainable animal, and it's not as inefficient. So I think really focusing on ways to increase animal health and improve resilience to diseases and things like that is a huge opportunity. And within that, genetics is a huge opportunity for the livestock sector. There's been a lot of progress, particularly in terms of like pig and poultry sectors, and I think in dairy as well as leading the way. But there's a lot more that can be done, for example, in the beef and sheep sectors, to really utilise genetics as a tool to improve sustainability, improve efficiency, potentially looking at disease resistance, climate resistance. They've done that in the arable kind of cropping sector. So I think that potential to breed for those disease resistance would be really exciting in the livestock sector. And really focusing on productivity. And as we said before, productivity and efficiency is sustainability. So I'm really focusing on in terms of how can you utilise things like animal health and genetics to improve productivity and essentially reduce their carbon footprint.
I think that link between animal welfare, like you said, health and genetics, and then reducing carbon footprint and environmental impact is really, really interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
There's a lot that can be done there in terms of improving nutrient efficiency, in terms of really increasing the quality of grassland, utilising nitrogen fixing legumes, not only to provide that soil health benefit, but also provide that sort of protein for the animal. And then also in terms of inhibiting methane, there's a lot at the moment, an opportunity in terms of methane inhibitors and feed additives to reduce methane from ruminants. This is a kind of growing space, and there's a lot of exciting innovators coming up there, which could really make an impact, not only for intensive sort of feeding, more indoor sort of systems, also we're seeing solutions for outdoor systems. So some really exciting opportunities there. And then obviously alternative feeds. I think this is a really exciting opportunity for the livestock sector, particularly looking replacing soya. A lot of the stakeholders within the industry have the commitments to remove based soya by 2025 as part of the EUDR commitment, looking at alternatives to soy, such as like insects, seaweed, legumes. There's all sorts of things there that can be explored. I think it's an exciting space for innovation. And I think another key opportunity, really utilising land, particularly in upland farming systems, these grasslands, which have been there for being part of that kind of farming system for years and years, sequestering carbon, a really strong soil structure. So really being able to measure and verify how much carbon is being sequestered in these lands and really provide that evidence is a huge opportunity. And then once we have that strong evidence base, being able to look at increasing that sequestration. So how can soil health be improved further? How can manures from livestock systems be harnessed and used to improve soils elsewhere in more mixed farming systems or in arable soils? But I think there is a lot to prove in terms of how much livestock can really benefit soil and benefit carbon sequestration.
I mean, it sounds like you're absolutely brimming with all of these amazing ideas for innovation and growth, and what the next 10 years will look like for the livestock industry and the research priorities that you would put first and foremost. So this idea of collaborative working is really central to what we do at the UK Agri-Tech Centre. How important do you think that is for us to achieve these goals, and how do you as an individual feel you can promote that?
Yeah, so in collaboration is really important to help us increase the impact of what we do for the industry. Some challenges just can't be addressed in silos. And I think an example of this is what I just mentioned before in terms of the soy commitment. Looking at bringing in non-deforested soy. It's not something that people can work on in silos. People have to come together. So a really great way that the UK Agri-Tech Centre sort of facilitated this was through a workshop. We brought different stakeholders from the industry together in a non-competitive space to really brainstorm and work on this challenge in terms of finding those ways we can work together and collaborate. It was really important in terms of working on those grand challenges. And then also from a project perspective, collaboration is really important in terms of sharing ideas, using each other's experience and utilising those different expertise, and also to increase resource available investment. The impact in terms of resource you can make from bringing people together to work on the same thing rather than doing it individually is huge, and it really has a lot more scope and potential to do something bigger and better and really accelerate innovation a bit faster. I think again also just that idea of like knowledge sharing and things like that is really important, and there's another example of what we do at the UK Agri-Tech Centres to really facilitate that collaborative working through open innovation groups. Again, bringing these people together in a non-competitive space that wouldn't usually have the opportunity to work together collaboratively to really work on those ideas and put them in contact with these different people that they wouldn't usually be able to work with. So bridging the gap between like the scientific community and the industry, linking up these innovators and tech companies who may not have that in the agriculture industry, given the opportunity to speak to businesses within the industry looking for these different solutions to fit within their supply chain. So I think it's just really important. It's something that is really key to us and my role within the Agri-Tech Centre.
So sustainability is obviously a really central theme to the work that you do and to the Livestock and Aquaculture report. And we know there needs to be a balance between increased productivity and food security and environmental responsibility and all these big challenges that are coming through for the livestock sector. I guess what I'd really like to know is, what future challenges do you anticipate? What do you think are the big ones for the livestock sector?
So I think the challenges that are relevant now and will still be relevant into the future, food security and the adaptation to climate change are really key, ensuring that our farmers and our supply chains are supported and are able to continue to produce food in a sustainable way. Climate change causing extreme weather events, flooding, temperature increases, droughts is putting extreme pressure on the supply chain of all parts. So not just on the arable side of things, but also looking at increasing feed prices and input prices for farmers, putting pressure on those margins. And then obviously, particularly in the livestock side as well, that disease risk, AI, avian influenza, TB, still really prevalent challenges for the industry, which is really disrupting progress in other areas. And then the recent sort of blue tongue outbreak. So this sort of the pressure of disease on the supply chain and how that impacts food security is really prevalent. And I think it's just something that needs to be underpin the sort of approach of what we really focus on going forward.
And so how would you say that the livestock industry as a whole can balance that need for increased productivity with environmental responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's really key, but essentially it is really important that farmers are productive and productivity is still ensured. That's what's really key to ensuring food security and resilient supply chains, which were from our previous reports highlighted from the industry as key challenges and key concerns at the moment is sort of maintaining food security. So it's really important that that is not forgotten about, but then there needs to be a balance and there needs to be a sweet spot found. And there's sort of things that looking at in sustainable systems around reducing those artificial inputs and really making use of what is already available on those farms. And it's also important to recognise that it can't always be about output. So there is going to be a time where we need to think about the environment.
So you talk a little bit about bridging the gap. I just want to ask a little bit about how your past experience growing up on farms and being quite close to the practical aspect of a lot of the innovation that we talk about, how does that influence the way that you work?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess it makes me think, particularly in terms of the adoption side of things and that knowledge exchange. For me, that knowledge exchange piece is really important in terms of the impact of what we are doing. So we're doing something really important within a project, then how is it actually going to be disseminated through the industry and through farmers? And it's a big thing of what we focus on, looking at barriers to adoption, longevity of technology on farm. What are the reasons why certain farmers aren't engaged in the process, and looking at the best ways to communicate with them. And the example of how we're doing that within one of our projects, Breed for Change, we're looking at understanding how we can better engage with farmers and bring them on the journey. And I think it's a really important piece. And I think ensuring that these stakeholders, so farmers and early sort of stakeholders within the supply chain, are consulted and brought on the journey from the get-go.
And if you had to pick a couple of key takeaways from the report and what really resonated with you, what would you pick?
For me, I think the first thing is collaboration. Bringing together all the right people in the industry to collaborate is really important. And I think it was recognised in the report and through the industry stakeholders that it is needed and is key to ensuring that we are working together to really maximise our impact and make a difference. And then the other thing is sustainability. I think ensuring that we're working towards a sustainable future for our livestock supply chains is really important. And when thinking about sustainability, we are considering all aspects of it holistically, looking at reducing our carbon emissions and our environmental impact in that way, but also looking at improving nature, protecting biodiversity, looking at water quality, that's really key as well. And then also looking at how we can ensure that our farmers are efficient and profitable and resilient in that aspect. And then also looking at that social sustainability as well. So really looking at sustainable food systems and understanding what that means for our supply chain and how it really contributes to the resilience of our farmers and our supply chain.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that really, really interesting insight. It's been great to get your take on the opportunities and challenges within livestock. And I think there are loads of exciting opportunities for the future that you mentioned, from improving animal health, genetics, embracing that holistic approach to sustainability that you talked about, and also environmental stewardship and social responsibility, which for me, they're real standout topics from this conversation. And I think I found it really interesting what you said about collaboration and how it underpins all of the work that we're doing. And it's really crucial in tackling the grand challenges. Which brings us to the end of this episode. So a huge thank you to Martin and Megan for sharing their insights on how these sectors are evolving and the potential they hold for a more sustainable future. In our next episode, we'll be taking a deep dive into livestock innovation, exploring cutting-edge research, the latest technologies, how farmers are adapting to create more efficient and sustainable farming systems, and more. And then in the final episode of the series, we'll return to aquaculture and have another chat with Martin, going even deeper into the opportunities and challenges shaping this sector. So many thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.